Chapter 1, A Lecture That Promised to Be Ordinary. The hum of voices filled the spacious lecture hall. The huge room with high ceilings, wooden rows of chairs and a wide screen in the center was filled with students ready for another lecture. Some were lazily flipping through notes, some were typing messages on their phones, and some were impatiently waiting for the class to start. Professor Laura Hastings was at the helm. Her name was well known in academic circles. Smart, sharp, charismatic, she was famous not only for her research in political science, but also for her uncompromising views. She had no patience for Republicans, believed that liberal values were the only true path for the country's development, and was not afraid to express her opinion. Today's lecture was special for her. The topic sounded academic, governance and human rights, but in reality the professor had something else planned. She knew Barron Trump would be in the audience. The youngest son of the 45th President of the United States. This fact became the main topic of discussion at the university for several days before the lecture. Many students, even those who usually ignored her classes, came today simply out of curiosity. Some hoped to see a big scandal. Some just wanted to see Professor Hastings embarrass the Trump family scion. Barron rarely appeared in public, and many were left with the impression that he was just like his father, straightforward, self-confident, maybe even a little arrogant. But no one knew what to expect. The lecture begins, the professor comes on stage. Hastings tapped her pen on the lectern to get the audience's attention. Good afternoon, students. I hope you are ready for a productive discussion. The voices in the audience gradually died down. Today we will talk about how the state is governed and how human rights are respected in this process. We will discuss various political approaches and try to understand which of them is the most effective. She paused, looking around the audience. And her eyes settled on Barron. He sat in the third row, listening quietly, his arms crossed over his chest. He was taller than most of the students, tall, fit, reserved. His face showed no tension, no fear, no irritation. He just waited. Hastings smirked. But, as you know, discussing politics is always a debate. And so I hope that today we will have students who are ready to boldly express their opinions. She glanced at Barron again, making it clear she was talking about him. Someone in the audience chuckled. Barron remained unperturbed. Preparing for an attack. Hastings began her lecture with the traditional overview of different models of public administration. She spoke about democracy, authoritarianism, social justice, and the rights of citizens. But gradually her speech began to take on a different tone. She began to mention Donald Trump more and more often. First, in a neutral tone. Then, with criticism. We all remember how the previous administration declared that, America first. But doesn't that sound like isolationism? Isn't that an attempt to ignore global problems? Isn't that a policy that violates human rights principles? She looked at Barron again. He remained silent. But I listened. The students began to look at each other. Some smiled, waiting for what would happen next. Hastings continued. We have a person in the audience today who can explain better than most what it means to be part of this system. Barron Trump, could you share your thoughts? All heads turned to look at him. There was silence. Barron looked up and at the professor. He understood perfectly well that it was a trap. That they are trying to provoke him into emotions. That they are expecting either a stupid answer or an irritated reaction. But he wasn't going to give it to them. He smiled calmly. Of course, Professor. What aspect of the topic interests you? Hastings narrowed her eyes slightly. Well, for example, how do you feel about your father's politics? Barron paused, as if considering his answer. Then he looked at her and said. And what is your attitude towards the policy of your party? A roar rolled through the hall. Some students burst out laughing. The professor raised her eyebrows. Do you want to change the subject? No, I just think that the discussion of politics should be two-sided. If we talk about the pros and cons of governing a country, we should look at both camps. Or do you think differently? Hastings was silent for a moment. Barron didn't look confused. He didn't look like a boy who could be cornered. He was calm. And he was clearly ready for this conversation. Okay, let's start with the simple stuff, Hastings said. How do you explain the fact that under the Trump administration, America has abandoned a number of international agreements that many have seen as a retreat from global cooperation? Barron bowed his head. Can we call a situation where one country is forced to go against its own interests for the sake of others, global cooperation? Shouldn't politics first and foremost protect the citizens of the country that is implementing it? Shouldn't a true leader put his nation first? Hastings pursed her lips. The students looked at each other again. They expected to see a frightened boy who would make excuses. But they saw an intelligent, cool-headed, confident young man. It was unexpected. And now everyone is wondering, what will happen next? The professor decided to change tactics. Okay. Then let's talk about human rights. How do you explain that during your father's presidency there were mass protests and his administration used harsh methods of suppression? Isn't that a violation of human rights? Barron looked at her with a slight grin. He knew where she was going with this. And he already knew how to answer. The lecture was just beginning. And it promised to be unforgettable. Chapter 2, Call to the Audience Center. Barron Trump, sitting in the third row, looked calmly at Professor Laura Hastings. He showed no sign of nervousness, even though he knew he was in for more than just a lecture. All around, the students froze in anticipation. It was like the moment before a fight, when everyone held their breath, waiting to see who would strike the first blow. Professor Hastings tilted her head to the side, regarding Barron with a slight smirk. Well, since we are talking about human rights and governance, it seems to me that we have a unique opportunity to get a comment from a person whose family was directly involved in these processes. She paused. Barron, why don't you come to the center of the room and share your opinion? A barely audible whisper ran through the hall. Some students looked at each other, some grinned, anticipating the show. Barron raised his head and looked straight at Hastings. There was no fear or embarrassment in his gaze. He could have refused. He could have simply brushed it off and said that he came here as a student, not as a representative of his family. But he knew it would be perceived as weakness. And he had no intention of showing weakness. Calmly, without unnecessary emotion, he rose from his seat and walked to the center of the audience. All eyes were now on him. The first maneuvers are a test of strength. Hastings raised her eyebrows slightly. She hadn't expected him to come out so easily, without the slightest sign of hesitation. She leaned forward, folding her hands on the lectern. Barron, thank you for agreeing. I think many here are interested in hearing your opinion. After all, your family is one of the most influential in modern American politics. She paused briefly, allowing the audience to soak in the moment. Barron stood confidently, without crossing his arms or hiding his gaze. Thank you, Professor. I am glad to participate in the discussion. His voice sounded even, confident, without unnecessary tension. Hastings chuckled. That's great. Let's start with something simple. What do you think is more important for a state, personal freedom or security? It was a classic question to which every politician had his own answer. Barron paused briefly before answering. Both of these principles are important. A true leader must find a balance between the freedom of citizens and the need to ensure their safety. Completely ignoring one of them, we get either anarchy or dictatorship. Some students in the room nodded understandingly. Hastings narrowed her eyes slightly. Interesting answer. But what about your father, who, according to many experts, prioritized security at the expense of freedom? Barron looked at her calmly. Whenever a politician makes a choice in favor of a certain strategy, someone is sure to criticize him. But let's talk facts. Which freedoms were infringed? The hall fell silent. The students didn't expect him to attack back. Hastings frowned slightly. Well, for example, when during the protests his administration used federal forces to suppress the demonstrations. Barron smiled slightly. Do you mean the riots in the summer of 2020? When hundreds of stores were looted, businesses destroyed, and thousands of people were hurt? Or are you talking about the mayors of democratic cities refusing to restore order? Surprised laughter could be heard from the audience. Hastings' expression didn't change, but now she had to change her tactics. Trying to put Barron on the defensive. She pretended not to notice the students' reaction. Are you saying that all the protesters were criminals? Doesn't that violate people's right to express their opinions? Barron looked at her calmly. Of course, not all protesters were criminals. But any protest that turns violent ceases to be peaceful. This is not politics, it is a banal crime. Can the destruction of cities be justified by the fight for justice? Some students began to applaud. Barron didn't try to be clever. He just used the facts. Hastings realized she was losing control of the situation. She took a deep breath and tried to change the direction of the conversation. Okay. Then another question. Your father often spoke about protecting traditional values. Do you think that politics should take into account the social changes that are happening in society? Barron nodded. Of course. Politics should always reflect the reality in which the people live. But any changes should happen naturally, and not be imposed from above. But what if society itself demands change? Society is millions of people with different views. The question is, why is the opinion of one group considered more correct than the opinion of another? If we are talking about democracy, we must respect different points of view. Seizing the initiative. Barron tilted his head slightly, as if assessing the professor's reaction. But allow me, Professor, now I will ask you a question. Hastings looked slightly surprised. Certainly. You say that politics must take into account social changes. But where is the line? Where does one person's freedom end and another's right to disagree with him begin? The hall came to life again. Some students were clearly beginning to look at Barron differently. Hastings thought for a moment. This is a difficult question. But, as a rule, the line is where the violation of the rights of others begins. But who determines what is considered a violation? She was silent for a moment. Barron continued. We live in a society where some people believe that any disagreement is discrimination. But freedom of speech is precisely the right to have different points of view. If one side demands the right to self-expression, but at the same time prohibits disagreement with itself, is that democracy? Round finale, audience changes opinion. Hastings did not respond immediately. She realized that Barron Trump was not at all what she expected. She hoped to see a confused teenager. But she saw a polite, intelligent interlocutor who not only takes a punch, but also asks questions that put her in an awkward position. The audience felt it. Barron wasn't angry. He didn't try to defend himself. He simply spoke the truth with confidence. And now he was the leader in this discussion. The professor looked at him. Well, it looks like we're going to have a very interesting conversation. Barron smiled slightly. I am at your service, Professor. The lecture continued. But now everyone understood that this was no longer just a lecture. It was an intellectual duel in which the professor was no longer in control. Chapter 3, The First Strike, Provocative Questions. Barron stood in the center of the room, surrounded by hundreds of students who were watching his dialogue with Professor Laura Hastings. The professor stepped back a little, as if considering, but in reality it was a prepared maneuver. She wanted to create the illusion of a friendly discussion, while her real goal was something else, to drive Barron into a corner. She knew that anyone in his position would be under a lot of pressure. He is the son of the most controversial president in the United States, and every phrase he says could be taken out of context and used against him. She knew the audience was expecting a show. And she was going to give it to them. Let's discuss human rights. Barron, do you agree that every U.S. citizen should have equal rights, regardless of their race, gender, orientation, and beliefs? The question was phrased in such a way that any answer he gave could be used against him. If he says yes, the audience will think he is trying to pander to the liberal agenda. If he says no, he will immediately be declared a fanatic. But Barron, without even blinking, calmly replied. Of course. This is the basis of the American Constitution and the whole principle of democracy. We are all equal before the law. The professor raised her eyebrows slightly. Okay. But if we are all equal, why do your family and your political party so often block reforms aimed at protecting the rights of minorities? Barron tilted his head slightly, as if thinking. What reforms exactly do you have in mind, Professor? She chuckled. Well, for example, why did your father cancel many initiatives concerning equality? Are you talking about the right to equal opportunities or the right to privileges? There was some light laughter in the audience. The professor frowned. What do you mean? I mean that the law should give everyone equal rights, but it should not artificially create an advantage for one group at the expense of another. If a person achieves something thanks to his work, and not because he belongs to a certain social group, that is equality. Isn't it? Someone in the audience applauded. The professor felt that the situation was starting to turn against her. The next attack is political criticism. She decided to increase the pressure. But your father didn't just change laws. He deliberately created rhetoric that divided people. Shouldn't a president unite the nation, not divide it? Barron took his time answering. He knew that hundreds of people were listening to him, and that tomorrow these words could appear in the news headlines. He paused briefly, looked at the audience, and then returned his gaze to the professor. The president must not lie to his people. There was silence in the hall. The professor narrowed her eyes. What do you mean? Many politicians prefer to tell people what they want to hear instead of telling the truth. They use beautiful slogans, promise that everything will be simple, blame someone else for all the problems. But a strong leader is not someone who says convenient things. It is someone who tells the truth, even if it is unpleasant. The professor leaned forward slightly. Do you mean to say that your father spoke only the truth? Barron nodded. He said what he thought. He didn't try to please everyone. And that's why he had both supporters and opponents. The professor folded her arms across her chest. So, in your opinion, disagreements within the country are normal? Barron smiled slightly. Disagreement is the foundation of democracy. If we no longer have the right to disagree with each other, then we no longer have freedom of speech. The applause from the audience grew louder. Some students looked at each other, some nodded, agreeing with his words. The professor quickly realized that she was losing her audience. She had to make one more move. The last jerk, a moral argument. She put on a serious expression and, after a pause, said. But politics is not only about laws. It is also a moral responsibility. Your father has made many statements that have been criticized for their harshness and rudeness. Shouldn't a leader be softer, kinder? Shouldn't a president care about people feeling safe? Barron looked at her. His face remained calm. The president must be fair. But sometimes his words hurt people. Is that right? Sometimes the truth hurts. But it is better to hurt with the truth than to console with a lie. The hall exploded with applause. Hastings bit her lip. She was no longer in control of the situation. Barron not only repelled all attacks, but also turned the discussion in his favor. He made no excuses. He did not argue aggressively. He simply explained his point of view logically, clearly and confidently. Conclusion: who outplayed whom? Hastings realized that her plan had failed. She hoped to portray Barron as an incompetent, confused young man. But he proved that he has knowledge, logic and endurance. She took a deep breath. Well, Barron, thank you for your answers. They were much more interesting than I expected. He nodded. Thank you for the interesting discussion, Professor. The audience applauded again. Barron turned around and calmly walked back to his place. But he already knew that this moment would change the perception of his personality. Today he was seen as more than just the president's son. Today he was seen as a strong intellectual opponent. And it was a victory that could not be disputed. Chapter 4, Taking the Initiative, an Intellectual Duel. The audience was still applauding Barron Trump. It wasn't just the polite clapping that students usually gave to support interesting remarks. No, it was a genuine recognition of his intelligence, logic, and confidence. Professor Laura Hastings knew she was losing control of the lecture. She started from a position of strength, an experienced scientist who asks provocative questions and drives the interlocutor into a corner. But now the situation has turned 180 degrees. Barron not only repelled all her attacks, but also began to control the conversation. This was unacceptable. She couldn't allow the audience to see him as the leader of the discussion. So she took a deep breath, pulled herself together, and launched a final offensive. Switching tactics, trying to catch on emotions. Hastings no longer paused long. Now she attacked quickly and forcefully, hoping to throw Barron off his rhythm. Barron, you talk about freedom of speech and democracy, but let's be honest. Your father often criticized the press, calling journalists enemies of the people. How does this fit in with your statements about freedom of speech? Isn't criticism of the press a step toward dictatorship? She folded her arms across her chest, confident that she had him cornered. But Barron didn't blink again. He just calmly replied. Professor, you agree that freedom of speech should be for everyone, not just those who control the media? Undoubtedly. Then why is it that when journalists criticize the government, it is called freedom of speech, but when the government criticizes journalists, it is called a threat to democracy? A murmur of approval was heard in the hall. Hastings narrowed her eyes. Are you comparing the press and the state? But the press is an independent institution, and the government always has the resources to exert pressure. Is it possible to put them on the same level? Barron tilted his head as if assessing her words. And how independent is the press today? If most major media outlets are owned by corporations with their own interests, can they be considered objective? Hastings felt a blow to a sore spot. She knew very well that many students had long since lost trust in the media, considering them biased. But she couldn't give in so easily. Okay, let's talk about you personally then. Barron, you grew up in a wealthy family, always had access to the best education, the best resources. How can someone with such a privileged position understand the problems of ordinary Americans? Barron paused. The question was tough. He understood that if he answered carelessly, his words would be taken out of context and used against him. But he was already prepared for such a turn of events. Professor, does birth determine intelligence? Should where you were born disqualify you from participating in a discussion? Is it only a person who has experienced hardships who can understand the hardships of others? She frowned but said nothing. Barron continued. You, a professor, were educated at one of the best universities in the country. You live in an academic world where you have a stable job and a high standard of living. Does this mean that you have no right to talk about the problems of the poor? The hall literally exploded with applause. The students looked at each other, some nodded, some smiled. Hastings felt a loss of control. But she still tried to keep the initiative. The last attack is an attempt to bring out emotions. She took a deep breath and moved on to emotions. Okay, Barron, but your father repeatedly stirred up hatred in society. Do you really not see what mark he left on history? What hatred he sowed? This was not an argument, but manipulation. She hoped that he would either start defending himself or lose his temper. But Barron remained cold-blooded. Professor, let me ask you, if someone disagrees with your opinion, is that hatred? She was at a loss. That's not what I mean. But Barron didn't stop there. Today, we have a strange situation in society. If you disagree with the mainstream opinion, you are called a fascist, a racist, an enemy of democracy. Isn't democracy the right to have different views? Isn't freedom of speech the right to argue? Why is one opinion considered correct and another hateful? The audience applauded loudly. Some of the students were already smiling openly as they watched Barron lead the discussion with the same confidence as an experienced politician. Hastings realized she had lost this round. She looked at him and said, "You are wise beyond your years, Barron." "Thank you, Professor. But perhaps it is because I am used to thinking critically, and not repeating other people's theses." The audience literally exploded with applause. Hastings closed her eyes for a moment, realizing that her plan had failed. Not only did Barron not lose his composure, he also made the audience think. He showed that he could not only answer, but also control the course of the conversation. And this was his main victory. He didn't just survive this intellectual duel. He won it. And Professor Laura Hastings now knew it. Chapter 5, The Ending, Respect and Unexpected Outcome. The room was still buzzing with excitement after Barron Trump's final answer. Even those students who had originally come with preconceived notions were now looking at him with interest and even admiration. Professor Laura Hastings realized that her original plan had fallen apart. She wanted to corner him, to show the audience that he was just the president's spoiled son, with no views of his own. But instead she gave him a stage on which he showed himself to be an intelligent, thoughtful, and confident conversationalist. She looked at the audience and saw that Barron had taken complete control of it. She lost this intellectual duel. But what's worse is that she lost in a fair fight. And that made her think. The last question is an attempt to save face. The professor took a deep breath and tried to regain her confidence. She walked closer to Barron, folded her arms across her chest and said, "Okay, Barron. You've shown that you can stand your ground. But here's my final question, if you were in your father's shoes, what would you do differently?" It was a smart move. Now she was forcing him not just to defend Trump's policies, but to critically analyze them. If he said he wouldn't change anything, it would sound like blind loyalty. If he started criticizing, it would look like weakness. Barron knew the question was a trap. But he was already too far ahead to lose at the last moment. He tilted his head slightly, as if thinking. And then he said, "I would do the same as my father, tell the truth, even if it is inconvenient. But perhaps I would explain my decisions better, so that people understand the meaning of them, and not just the emotions around them." The hall quietly began to buzz. This answer was the perfect balance between dedication and thoughtful analysis. He did not reject his father's legacy, but at the same time he showed that he was capable of thinking for himself. Audience reaction, a turning point in perception. Some students who had initially come to the lecture with prejudice now looked at each other with respect. Someone whispered to a neighbor, "This guy is really smart. Yes, I thought he was just the president's son, but he really thinks deeper." Others wrote messages on social media. "Barron Trump smashed a professor at her own game today. I'm shocked. I thought it would be funny, but it turns out Barron is smarter than half the politicians in this country." Hastings saw it. She realized that the students had taken away from her lecture today the ideas that she had not intended to convey. Admitting defeat is a rare moment of honesty. She looked at Barron, sighed and, suddenly smiled. This was not the expression she had on her face when she began her lecture. There was no arrogance in that smile. There was recognition in it. Well, Barron, I have to admit, you surprised me. Barron nodded slightly. Thank you, Professor. I didn't expect you to be so confident. And to be honest, I thought I could out-argue you. Some students laughed. Hastings chuckled, but then turned serious. You are right about one thing, democracy is impossible without debate. And perhaps I approached this conversation too abruptly. But I admit, it was interesting for me to discuss with you. Barron smiled. Debates are part of American culture, Professor. I was glad to participate in them. Coming out of the auditorium is a respect that no one expected. The professor gestured that the lecture was over. The students began to stand up, some headed for the exit, but many were still discussing what they had heard. Barron turned to leave, but suddenly one of the students approached him. Hey, Barron. Can I ask you a question? Barron turned around. Certainly. The student looked a little embarrassed, but there was genuine respect in his eyes. Do you always answer like that? Or was it just for show? Barron smiled slightly. I always answer like that. It's just that today I was given a platform for it. The student nodded, thought for a moment, and then said. I didn't vote for your father and was against him in general. But today you made me think. Thank you for that. Barron looked at him and nodded. Thanks for listening. After that, he turned around and calmly walked out of the auditorium. Aftermath, the day that changed everything. This lecture became the most discussed event at the university. Someone said that Professor Hastings was defeated. Someone claimed that Barron Trump had proven that he was much smarter than everyone thought. Some people were simply amazed at how confident he was. But most importantly, Barron changed his perception of himself. He was no longer just the president's son. He was now seen as an intellectual in his own right, able to take a punch, ask tough questions and engage in serious debate with dignity. And Professor Hastings, sitting at her desk and looking through the students' messages, knew that this day would become a legend in the history of the university. She smiled, shook her head and quietly said to herself. This guy will go far.